Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 7. Today, we're going to be talking about access controls. We have Karanjot Jaswal, who is our CTO and the co-founder of Cinchy, so he's going to be presenting today. Just a reminder as well, this is an ongoing series, so today we are covering off universal controls, but we do have episodes 1 through to 6 already available on demand, and you can find them by going to Cinchy TV, or you can also go to cinchy.com/learn, and you can see the episodes all available there as well. When you go to cinchy.com/learn, you're able to sign up for the next episode, and I'll be showing you episode number 8 as we proceed through this session in a few minutes. So you'll be able to sign up for next week at any minute. So just one final slide, letting you know that we are going to be showing you a demo today. We'll be stopping for questions, and Karan will be asking you if there's specific questions that you want to ask. Feel free to use the comment section or the chat section to just leave questions if you're not comfortable interrupting, but we will try to pause and make sure that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. Interrupting is okay. It's better that we interrupt and make sure everybody's following along on all of the concepts. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll hand this over to you, Karan, so that you can take everybody through the demo and have a little fun with the way that we're going to be taking you through this experience.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. And thank you guys all for joining. Let's pull this up. Everyone can see my screen okay, right?
I can see it, yes.
Perfect. Okay. So today's topic is all centered around universal controls. So let's start off with what we actually mean by universal controls. So of course, in the world of data, controls is a very complicated topic. There's so many different areas of concern when you think about controls. It includes quality-related controls. You have governance, compliance, privacy, information security. All of these different facets exist. And of course, in Cinchy's data fabric, you have a rich set of capabilities that support all of these different facets and address these areas. And Dan, in past sessions, has actually demonstrated a lot of these capabilities, touching on things like version history for any data change that takes place on the platform, the fact that Cinchy has a recycle bin for deleted data, its data erasure capabilities where it has a retention policy, encryption at rest and in transit, approval workflows on data changes, and more capabilities like that. But these capabilities are actually not the focus of today's session. Today's all about access to data and how entitlements are managed inside of the platform. So I'm not sure how many of you are fans of The Office. I for one am. But we have poor Michael Scott here, who's just received an email with a spreadsheet that contains salary information for staff across all of the various branches that his employer, Dunder Mifflin. Now that he's inadvertently received a copy of this data, it's completely in his control with it, right? Who can he tell? Should he tell anybody? Does he share that with anyone? Is he able to send a copy of that over? And knowing his personality, you probably won't be able to keep it a secret. But the point being that the owner of the data, the owner of this sensitive information at this point has lost control. And that's a byproduct of this approach of data sharing, where copies of information are sent around and provided to one another. Now you must be thinking, well, if this data was in an HR management system and it was not in a spreadsheet, then doesn't that solve this problem? Because then Michael would be accessing the application and he wouldn't have a copy of that data, right? It's less likely that a problem would occur. The platform itself would have been tested. If there was an issue with access, it could be corrected in the application itself and control's not lost. And the paradigm that you're thinking of there is it's access, not copies, right? You want to grant access to data, you don't want to provide a copy of data. And that's true at this level of scale. So if you were to distinguish the spreadsheet-based approach with that of leveraging an application in this context, that certainly works, where you have a single spreadsheet, a single app to replace it. But when you zoom out of the one use case and you think about beyond this one data set, the challenge with application code controlling access to data is that data is still copied between applications, right? The same piece of sensitive information can exist in dozens, maybe even hundreds of different applications inside your organization. And that makes it virtually impossible to control. Because how do you consistently enforce controls on data in hundreds of different touch points or dozens of different touch points? And a simple example of that is just your salary information, right? Of course, the HR management system is your book of record for that data. So that one system will have that information. But in addition to that, it's going to be present in finance systems. It'll be present in payroll systems and reporting data marts and warehouses. It's all over the place. And the gap here, like the most fundamental gap that exists here, is that the controls don't actually live with the data. The controls are implemented in code. So in your traditional applications, which you see here on the left-hand side, these are the various components of an application. The persistence and controls are embedded within the one app. And so by taking that approach to implementing solutions, it means that the moment that the data moves, because you're replicating that data between your different systems, taking that salary as an example where it exists in all of those different locations, the controls don't move along with that data, right? Each one of those systems needs to go and implement their own controls. So when we talk about universal controls on data in the context of a fabric, really what we're talking about is changing that paradigm. So when you're leveraging a data fabric, what you're doing is you're shifting the model to one where the controls are actually surrounding the data itself. And any solution that is accessing that data now, of course, must respect those controls because they are implemented in that centralized fabric. And so that's really what this visual is intending to represent, where you have the data in the center organized as part of the fabric, and then a vault surrounding it. So anything that's trying to access it, be it an existing system, be it the Cinchy's out-of-the-box metadata experience or additional application experiences that are created, regardless of whether they have UIs or just APIs or any other components, they all have to respect the controls that are configured at that layer. So that's the key concept and how it all fits together and why universal controls are so important. So with that being said, what I'll do now is I'll actually this also gives you just a quick sense of it. So in an app-centric model, you have the code which contains those controls connecting into the data. And the contrast with a data-centric approach is one where the controls and data are together and the code is up here connecting into that. There's an additional key difference there, which is this piece about the users, right? So what happens with the users on the left-hand side is that the code is aware of who the users are, but when the code interacts with the data, at that point, typically the implementation pattern is that a single account is used for the application to access that data, right? So you have some sort of service account or a functional account, and that's this layer down here. And that's why the controls exist up at the top. When you shift this model, there's a second component that needs to shift, which is that actually the data layer needs to be aware of who's directly interacting with it, who the users are. And that's why you see that behind this code, these lines are actually passing through, because that context of who the user is that is performing an action needs to be made available at this level. And that's when you think about the implementation of application experiences, that's exactly what's happening. And that's why both the persistence and controls are pushed down to this level. Okay, so with that, what I'll do is I'll switch over now to a demo, but before I do, are there any questions on that concept? Okay, great. So you may have seen this if you've seen some of the other learning series sessions, but this is our Cinchy environment. So Cinchy as an organization, we've adopted our own, we've adopted our own product and use it to manage pretty much all aspects of our business. So this is my view of our data fabric and our network of information. So inside of this, I've, for demo purposes, actually created two data sets inside of a Dunder Mifflin domain. Right? So one of these data sets is the branches. So this table here contains information about all of the branches of Dunder Mifflin as an organization. It has the name of the various branches, what state it belongs to, or belongs in, and who the branch manager is, with that branch manager now being a link back to an employee record. The second data set, of course, is now those employees. So within the Dunder Mifflin domain, I have who all of the employees are. And so here I'm seeing a link back to the branch because every employee belongs to a branch. I have the name, position, the salary, phone, home address. So this is a combination of some, let's say, non-sensitive data, information that you would typically expect to see in something like an employee directory, and other sensitive information like your salary and your home address even. And in addition to all of these attributes, I also have this one extra piece, which is a Cinchy user account. So this is a link back to the system table inside of Cinchy called users that contains all of the users that can log in and authenticate against this particular environment. So it's creating an association between who this employee is and what account do they log in with if they're accessing Cinchy. So now, now that I have these two data sets, I have branches, I have employees. If I was one of these employees and I was to log in, by default, I don't necessarily get access to this. I don't get access to the data. So let's say that I'm Michael Scott, I log into the Cinchy environment. If I search for Dunder Mifflin, I'm not actually seeing those two data sets, right? So what I need to do in order to make that information available is I actually have to grant access to this data. So let's start with the employees. I'm going to go ahead and provision entitlements to this data. And the way that that is done is inside of any one table in the platform. That's the container of the level at which you grant access. And so you do that through the control screen here, where I'm able to manage the entitlements to this particular data set. And the entitlements are granted to either users and or groups. And in this scenario, our recommendation is of course always to use groups and use your groups as roles. So for the purposes of this demo, what I've done is I've created a group called Dunder Mifflin employees. And so this contains all of the employees of Dunder Mifflin, in this case for all of the accounts that I've set up. Each column here represents now an entitlement, a grant that I can provision. And so if we were to walk through these, the first grant is this one called Marketplace, which controls whether or not, as I search for these objects, just as I was under Michael Scott's account, so here I'm in a separate window logged in as Michael Scott. If I was to search for this, am I able to find it inside of the Marketplace? And so of course, in this situation, we do want to give Michael the ability to do that. Can you bulk export data? Are you able to query data? Can you design the structure of this table? So can I add columns, remove columns, change the configuration of the table itself? Can I do what I'm doing now, which is designing these controls, so granting access? And so this level of granularity actually gives you the ability to have segregation of duties. So you can have different roles that are accountable for provisioning access versus those that are responsible for now managing the structure of tables. And then moving on, you have the ability to now grant access to either view all columns or specific attributes. So in this case, I don't want to grant an entitlement to view all columns. Instead, what I want to do is grant the non-sensitive attributes. So let's start there. So I want to grant access to branch, first name, last name, the phone number, and the position. Okay, so I now have these 5 attributes that I'm provisioning access to. In addition to that, I can control who can edit and which attributes you can edit. If approval workflows are turned on, which attributes a particular user or group can approve, whether they can add rows, delete rows. And then there's additional qualifiers that narrow the scope of this entitlement. So a viewable row filter is a condition that will actually narrow only when that condition evaluates to true will you be allowed to see these columns. Similarly, you can have an editable row filter that only when that condition evaluates to true are you able to see these things or edit these. So if I now come back and I do the same thing, so let me go ahead and refresh this. And so now I see that the employees data set is available, right? So let me go into that. So I'm logged in as Michael Scott. I see all of the employees and I see the attributes that I've provisioned access to. So I'm seeing first name, last name, position, phone number. Well, if I look back at the view selected columns though, what you'll note is that I've actually provisioned access here to 5 columns. So Cinchy ID being a system attribute is considered non-sensitive. It's always made available, but I'm missing branch. So I'm seeing everything else but that. So why is that? Now, the reason for that is because inside of Cinchy, remember you're provisioning access to data at the actual level of the data, the table itself, right? I've granted access to the employees table as the owner of this particular data set. I'm provisioning access to that, but the branch is a link. So this value Scranton is actually coming from a different table called branches. And on this table, I've not yet provisioned access. And so because Michael doesn't have access to the contents of this table, although he has access technically to the link, he's not able to see these details. And that's why he's not seeing the branch coming back. And so now, if in this case, we go ahead and we want to provision that same access, so none of the data inside of the branches data set here is sensitive. So I'm going to go ahead and grant view all access to all information inside of branches. Then if I come back as Michael Scott, let me go ahead and refresh that. So now I'm seeing the branch details here. And so I'm seeing Scranton, I can click through, it'll take me to the corresponding data set. If I was to search in the marketplace for branches, I'd find it now. So this is my entitlement for non-sensitive information, right? So I've granted sorry, if I go back to employees, I've granted the one entitlements to allow me to view these details. So regardless of which employees logging in, they should be able to see the same set of data as per this grant. Now I want to take this a step further and I want to grant access to sensitive information. But I want to control the access to that grant so that you can't see the sensitive attributes for every record inside of the system. Instead, I want you to be able to see that only for yourself. So let me go ahead and create another grant. So I'm going to grant to Dunder Mifflin employees the ability to view now the salary and the home address. But the salary and home address, you shouldn't always be able to see. You should only be able to see it when you're looking at your own record. So the way that this works is that, recall I had an attribute inside of this table, which linked back to the users inside of Cinchy. So it allowed me to actually create an association between the individual that is authenticated and who the employee is. So by taking advantage of that link, what I can now do is I can define a filter condition here that traverses the Cinchy user account, so navigates now to the users table, and then grabs the Cinchy ID of that user. So the Cinchy ID in the platform is a unique identifier for any record that exists. And I want to match this against the current user ID. Now, by doing this, what it will do is when I come back as Michael Scott, I've created the second entitlement, which is narrower in scope. I'm seeing that Michael Scott is now able to see the salary and home address, but only for his own record, right? So if I was to now log in as a different individual, so let's say I log in as Pam Beasley, so let me go ahead and do that, and then as Dunder Mifflin employees. So note that Pam's not seeing Michael's salary and home address, Pam is seeing her own. So now I want to take this a step further though, right? So the entitlements are now being driven off of a rule that I've established, which is based on the data inside of this table. But maybe I want to drive it off of data that's in a different table. So as a manager of a particular branch, I should be able to see not only my own salary information, but for the people that are in my branch. So in order to do that, this entitlement, we can expand upon it and make it so that it's not just about the Cinchy user account tying back, so the current record, but I can also now take advantage of the fact that the branch is a link that links to a table called branches. Branches has an attribute called branch manager, which is a link that links back to this employees table. And that branch manager now has a Cinchy user account, and that in turn has a Cinchy ID. Right? So this is now all about who is the manager of the branch that this particular record is located within, and I can match that against the current user ID. Now, by doing this, if I was to flip over and log in as Michael Scott, so of course as Pam, who I'm still logged in as here, nothing changes. Pam's not the branch manager. But if I log in now as Michael Scott and I go back into that employees data set, I'm now seeing the details of all of the other employees inside of my current branch. If I went back to the branches data set and let me go ahead and view all records, and let me change this so that Michael is no longer the branch manager for Scranton. If I go back to Michael and refresh, this of course immediately takes effect, and it's now narrowing the scope of what Michael is able to see based on the entitlements. Since he's no longer a branch manager, he just sees his own record. Right? And so the entitlements here are now data driven. They're based upon the other information about the employee. So whether they're a branch manager, and of course you can extrapolate this and use this in any other context to build out complex policy driven rules that control who can see what information at what point in time. And it's not just limited to see, it also works in the context of change as well. So if I go back to employees, if I want to now make it so that the home address is something that is editable, but you can only edit this for your own record, I can take the exact same approach. I'll make this editable here, and I'll say this is only going to be editable when this first part of the condition, meaning it's your record, evaluates to true. Right? And so now by doing this, if I go back here and I refresh this, now all of a sudden 45 Kingsway Circle is no longer grayed out, it's now an editable field. So this, you're seeing the controls being applied directly against the data. And this is true for, you're seeing now this in the context of Cinchy's metadata experience, which is this out of the box UI where I'm able to go in and look at the data inside of any table and experience that data and interact with it. If I now want to look at or access this through different channels, so that's in the context of that metadata experience, looking at the table. Now, let's look at some of the other objects or ways in which you can go about accessing this data. So here's a simple query, a select statement that is running against this employee's data set where I'm pulling back these attributes. Notice that I don't have any additional sort of filter conditions, anything that would control the access to this data. But this here, which is a query inside of Cinchy, also is a REST endpoint. If I was to access this as that same user, so now logging in as sort of Michael, you see that the home address is limited to his own personal record, right? He's only getting back those details for his own row. Similarly, if I was now hitting that API endpoint that this particular query exposes, where it's returning the result in JSON, I'm seeing that here, me logged in as myself, where I'm an admin, I have access to all data. But if Michael was to run that that same API, so I'll just copy that from the other tab. Notice how the values, the third attribute, which happens to be the home address, is actually null for all records except for Michael's own personal record. So that is through the through the query side of things. And when you go beyond that, so forms, so in the last session of the learning series, we used metadata-driven forms. It's true in that as well. So it here, if I look at this particular record through a form, so this is a metadata-driven form. If I'm accessing Daryl's row as an example, everything for me is read-only. I'm not seeing the salary or home address information. If I now go to Michael's own personal record, I'm seeing those details, and the home address is editable. So everything is dynamically adapting based on those controls that are governed in a single location or centrally governed. That's all within the platform, and you can take it a step further and even now access from outside of the platform. So let's say that I'm coming in through Tableau. So Cinchy natively has its own, has a web data connector for Tableau. So here I'm gonna go ahead and connect to this instance of Cinchy. And I'm going to under the Dunder Mifflin sort of domain. So let me pull this data set down and update that. Notice how it is also respecting those access controls, because everything is always under the guise of that user, right? So Cinchy at all times, the data fabric at all times knows who the user is, and it is releasing information based upon who that authenticated user is. And that is the key difference. So coming back to this point here about, in this situation, the controls don't live with the data, and the data layer has no idea who the users are. That's what changes with this universal controls-based implementation, where now the controls are down here and it always knows who that user is. And then just a couple more things to touch on. So in terms of best practices, you want to collaborate on data. You don't want to share information. So that's the whole paradigm of access, not copies. And that's exactly what we've demonstrated here. As the access changes, it immediately takes effect. You never lose control over that data. The second is this pattern of the data knows who the user is, and so the user to data direct relationship, not the user to code to data. And that is truly that secret to having universal controls. The third is that you're changing how you build in order to guarantee governance. So with Cinchy, when you're building out solutions, because by default, as you saw, when that data set existed, Michael didn't have access until we explicitly granted access. This paradigm actually focuses, it forces you to make governance not an afterthought, but something that's at the forefront. It guarantees it. The fourth piece is establishing ownership of data by individual people or legal entities. So you always want to take into consideration who the owner is of data and make sure that that owner always has control over who has access to information. And that ties into number 5, where either that owner is the one that is governing the access to the data, or they're able to delegate the control to a custodian who can now do that on their behalf. As an example, if you're an organization, so for us, Cinchy Inc. is the owner of the data inside of our platform, then in that situation, it would be delegating to a named custodian who's actually going about provisioning that access. You want to organize the domains around ownership. So for example, in our instance of Cinchy, I own the engineering domain as the CTO. And so I'm accountable for the data within that domain. And that makes it a lot clearer when you're going about distributing the ownership and management and maintenance of all of this, such that people are clear on exactly where their responsibilities lie. Cinchy does support data classification. So as you're creating data structures, classifying data as you're building that out. And again, this ties back into the governance side of things. Performing regular attestations on your data level access. And the way to go about that, there's multiple sort of patterns you could use. All data inside of the platform, or all the entitlements related data, is actually managed inside of tables in Cinchy. It's all queryable. It's all part of the meta architecture where that is available and can be extracted and can be queried. You want to, as I had mentioned earlier, grant access to groups and use those groups as roles. Avoid granting access to individual people. So that's aligning with even the best practices of today as to how you would go about building solutions. And then where you have single sign-on infrastructure available in an Active Directory in use for the management of these groups or roles, then leverage that infrastructure and have that connect into the fabric so that it's able to piggyback on your existing investments.